before anything existed, the eternal silence, before fire had learned to roar, before ice had learned to harden, before even the gods had names to answer to, there was no darkness. Darkness requires something to contrast, and contrast requires existence. What existed first was neither darkness nor light. It was neither void nor fullness. It was silence, and silence does not need anything to be complete. The silence did not wait. It did not breathe. It did not think. To wait requires time. To breathe requires life. And to think requires division. None of these existed. There was no before, no after, no above, no below. Time had not yet begun its slow bleeding forward. Space had not yet learned how to stretch. There was no distance, no measure, no way to tell if anything was more or less, larger or smaller. It was not calm, for calm implies turbulence that has passed. It was not peace, for peace implies struggle that has ended. It was not void, for void is absence, and absence presumes presence. This silence was beyond such things. It was whole, indivisible, absolute. It had no need for name, form, or memory. There was nothing to distinguish it, nothing to define it. It simply was. The silence did not speak. There was no sound, no echo, no vibration. There was no mind to observe it, no tongue to name it, no ear to hear it. And yet, in the depths of this eternal stillness, there was a potential, faint, almost imperceptible, like frost forming across a lake that does not yet exist. A thread so subtle that it could barely be sensed, though no one was there to sense it. This subtle thread was the first fracture. Not rebellion, not creation, not intention, simply difference. In all its existence, the silence had known only itself. Now, something was no longer identical to the whole. Something was not nothing, and yet it was not yet anything. It had no shape. It had no thought. It had no name, and yet it was. No god existed to claim this moment. No elemental force had been stirred into being. No creature, mortal or immortal, had yet learned to breathe, to think, or to act. And still, the first distinction emerged, quiet as ice, cracking under a weight that has not yet fallen. The silence did not resist. Resistance is an act. There was no act to perform. There was no will to oppose. And yet, once this small separation existed, the silence could not return to perfection. It endured as it always had, yet it had changed. Change requires nothing but difference. And now difference had been born. From this fracture came the faintest possibility of motion. Not motion as mortals would know it, not movement that can be measured by feet or wings, or the turning of worlds. This was motion as idea, as potential, as possibility. A subtle trembling beneath the surface of completeness, so faint that it could not be detected even if one had ears, even if one had sight. The gods would call it chaos. Skalds would later whisper of it as the yawning abyss. But these are lies told by beings who live after division, who mistake contrast for conflict, who mistake emergence for failure. For the silence, this subtle difference was neither error nor flaw. It simply was. And because it existed, everything else would eventually come to be. From this point, the silence began to hold the possibility of opposites. Ice and fire, stillness and storm, shadow and light. These would be born not as enemies, but as reflections of this first fracture. Not yet realized, not yet named, but present in the way a seed holds the memory of a tree it has not yet become. The silence did not move. It did not awaken. It did not anticipate. And yet, beneath its eternal stillness, the conditions for creation had begun to stir. A faint tension ran through its depth, like the thinnest thread of frost over a frozen lake. One would not notice it at first. One could not notice it. But once it existed, it had always existed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The silence was not lonely, for loneliness requires the presence of other. But it was no longer undivided. It held within itself the first hint of division, something that would not be contained, that would not remain the same, that would eventually grow into fire and ice, into gods and giants, into the worlds and all the beings that inhabit them. And in this faintest distinction lay a secret older than thought. All things born of division carry within them the weight of eternity. The gods would later learn this in fear. Mortals would later feel this as grief. And all creatures, in the silence of night or the shadow beneath the world tree, would sense it as the quiet pull toward endings. The silence endured. It had endured before all things, and it would endure after all things. It had no joy, for joy requires suffering to compare against. It had no sorrow, for sorrow requires loss. It had no memory, for memory requires change. And yet, in enduring, in being unbroke, it had allowed the first possibility of change to exist. The first fracture grew subtly stronger. It did not scream, it did not shout. It simply whispered in its own ancient tongue. Not in words, but in vibration, tension. The merest pressure against itself. From it, the future could begin to stir. Faint sparks, imperceptible and fragile, began to dance within the silence. Not fire as mortals know, not heat as they feel, but the glimmer of potential, the echo of what would later become flame. Eyes responded in kind, tightening around it, testing it, feeling its own limits. And somewhere, in the unmeasured distance that had not yet been, shadow stretched as if to mark its boundaries, whispering of all that could be, and all that must remain unknown. Thus, the first duel was fought, not of beings, not of armies, not of gods, but of forces themselves, waiting to become. fire and ice, light and shadow, motion and stillness, each balanced upon the fractal edge of a silence that could not yet bend, could not yet break. Later, the gods would claim victory over chaos. They would say they had forged order from nothing. They would craft thrones of fire, crowns of frost, and laws to bind the worlds. But they would be wrong. They did not conquer the silence. They did not even touch it. They merely floated upon it, ignorant of the foundation that held them. The silence waits still, beneath the bones of the mountains, beneath the roots of the world tree, beneath the waters that sleep in the deepest rivers. The silence persists. It remembers nothing, it judges nothing, it commands nothing. And yet, it is older than gods, older than time, older than fire, ice, and stone. And from the faintest fracture it bears, all things are possible. All things must come, all things will return. For even the gods, mighty as they are, and even mortals, fleeting as they may be, cannot escape the weight of what came before all things. Before the first breath, before the first word, before the first lie, there was only the silence, eternal, patient, unbroken, and from it all worlds would rise, but not yet. And though the silence remains silent, it holds within it the knowledge of what is to come. It waits, not for a beginning, not for an end, but for the first movement that will draw everything else into being. It is patient, it is eternal, it is beyond judgment. And so, even as creation lies unborn, even as gods do not yet stir, and worlds do not yet take shape, the first story is already written, carved invisibly in the silence itself. For what is creation but the echo of that first difference? What is life but the trace left by the fracture in what was whole? And what is all that we call the universe but a trembling upon the eternal silence that watches, unmoved beneath it all?